Welcome to an exploration of one of the most unsettling chapters in Appalachian history. Today, we delve into the occurrences that profoundly disturbed Virginia's mountain communities in 1921, a period when the quiet of the deep woods concealed secrets that were never meant to be uncovered. The Virginia Appalachians have always possessed a distinct character, with peaks enveloped in thick mist, sunless hollows, and remote settlements existing as if detached from the passage of time. It was the fall of 1921 as the Wise County area braced for the harsh winter. The rough dirt roads became treacherous pathways, especially when rain transformed them into streams of mud. The families dwelling in these highlands relied on hunting, subsistence farming, and coal mining for their survival. Existence was rugged, and legal authority was often absent or delayed. Marybelle Carter, aged 32, was a figure of notable and contentious reputation around Norton, a small town nestled in the mountains. She defied the conventions expected of women in that era, traveling alone, dealing in land, visiting taverns, and speaking directly with men, which unsettled even the most liberal among them. Her dark hair was perpetually in a severe bun. Her gaze was intense, and her determined walk made her a presence that could not be overlooked. She resided in a secluded cabin on the county's higher slopes, a wooden structure guarded by old trees that formed a natural shield against observation. Visitors were rare. Those who ventured up the slope shared odd tales of lights, seen flickering in the windows before dawn, of voices carrying across the valley on still nights, and of a pervasive sense of unease that seized anyone who approached too closely. When Marybelle did come down to town for supplies or to conduct business, her arrival invariably sparked whispers. The initial indication of trouble emerged in mid-October. A farmer named Thomas Belmont, living a few miles from Marybelle's land, informed the local sheriff of unusual activity near her cabin, noting fresh tracks from a horse and wagon, which was uncommon for such a solitary inhabitant. Thomas also reported a powerful, sickening odor emanating from the direction of the property. Sheriff Harold Pritchard received the account with doubt, viewing Marybelle as a frequent subject of baseless gossip and seeing little cause for an investigation. However, further reports followed. A week later, Estelle Monroe arrived at the sheriff's office with a worrisome story. Her brother, Leonard Monroe, a traveling merchant, had gone to Marybelle's property 3 weeks prior to sell his wares and had not been heard from since. Despite Estelle's pleas, Sheriff Pritchard only promised to look into the matter. The situation escalated when hunters discovered abandoned personal items in a clearing near Marybelle's land, including belongings that identified the owner as Leonard Monroe. Confronted with this evidence, Sheriff Pritchard could no longer delay. He assembled 2 deputies and set out for the remote cabin. The ascent was arduous, the path slick with wet leaves, and a feeling of being watched haunted the men. Upon reaching the property, an eerie silence prevailed. The cabin appeared deserted, its windows shuttered and door secured. After receiving no response to his knocks, the sheriff forced entry. Inside, the atmosphere was heavy with the sense of a terrible event. The interior was dim, with thick curtains blocking the light, and the air carried a stale, peculiar smell. A lantern revealed signs of recent occupation: dirty dishes, scattered clothing, and warm ashes in the hearth. Papers lay strewn across a central table, some seeming to be business records, others cryptic notes. A rear door led to a cellar. Descending the creaking stairs, the odor intensified. The underground space was larger than anticipated, with shelves holding not provisions, but jars of dark liquids, nailed shut boxes, and an assortment of personal effects: shoes, hats, bags, watches, and rings that clearly belonged to various individuals. Among them was a wallet containing Leonard Monroe's identification. This confirmed the grim suspicion. Leonard was not the only victim. Belongings suggested at least 5 or 6 other people. Mostly itinerant traders reported missing in recent years. A diary hidden under old fabrics, with entries beginning in 1918, detailed Marybelle's life, her financial struggles, and her growing resentment toward the community. The tone shifted over time, mentioning opportunities presented by passing travelers, cordial meetings that ended abruptly, and references to individuals who, after visiting for a meal or shelter, never left the mountain. The implications were clear. Marybelle had found a grim solution to her hardships. Sheriff Pritchard felt a chill realizing the scale of the discovery. This was not an isolated crime. He ordered every potential piece of evidence collected. During this process, a deputy noticed drag marks on the dirt floor, leading to a section of the rock wall that had been altered to form a hidden compartment. Removing the stones revealed a secret chamber carved into the mountain rock, containing traces of what Marybelle had concealed for years. The evidence was now undeniable and horrifying. Pritchard knew this case would permanently alter Wise County's history. News of the discovery spread rapidly through the Virginia mountains, with rumors multiplying in taverns, churches, and town squares. Sheriff Pritchard, recognizing the gravity, requested aid from neighboring counties to find Marybelle, who had vanished. Investigators meticulously cataloged every item from the property. Among the finds were unsent letters from individuals like William Hodges, who wrote of a promising deal with a mountain woman and a planned return home, a return that never happened. Local newspapers, like the Norton Gazette, ran headlines speaking of disturbing discoveries and dark secrets, carefully reporting that belongings from at least 6 travelers from 1918 to 1921 had been identified. Public opinion was divided. Some saw Marybelle as a cold, calculating murderer who preyed on innocent travelers. Others recalled her hardships. Widowed after her husband died in a mining accident in 1916, she was left alone with few resources in a society offering scant support for women in her position. Some speculated that isolation and desperation had warped her morality. The search parties expanded, scouring trails, valleys, and caves. The rough Appalachian terrain provided endless hiding spots, and the dropping late October temperatures raised concerns for Marybelle's survival if she was injured or unprepared. A breakthrough came on the 5th day from rancher Elijah Booker, who reported seeing a woman matching Marybelle's description 2 days before the cabin's discovery, heading south on an old hunter's trail toward Lee County, carrying a large pack and avoiding interaction. Sheriff Pritchard redirected the search southward. This trail was hazardous, narrow, and prone to landslides. 3 days into this focused search, the team found a recent, cold campfire with fresh ashes and single-person footprints consistent with a woman's. This confirmed they were on the right path, but also showed Marybelle was moving swiftly through difficult country. As the manhunt continued, more neighbors came forward with recollections. Dorothy Simmons remembered Marybelle appearing in town after long absences, with surprising amounts of money for bulk supplies. Merchant Albert Raines recalled Marybelle attempting to sell him various valuables over the years, items he now suspected were trophies from her victims. The portrait of Marybelle Carter was becoming clearer, a woman who had crossed a terrible threshold. Yet crucial questions lingered. How did she lure travelers to her property? What transpired during those mountain nights? And above all, where was she now? A palpable tension gripped the region. Doors were locked early. Travelers avoided remote areas. And the fear that Marybelle might be watching from the shadows kept the community on edge. The case had transcended a mere criminal investigation. It had become a somber symbol of what can fester when isolation, despair, and a lack of compassion converge in the deep shadows of the Appalachians. Following the footprints, the group reached an area known locally as Raven's Gorge, a deep ravine carved by a mountain stream. This location held a sinister reputation among residents, with tales of travelers vanishing in its sudden fogs or meeting fatal ends on the cliffs. The strange acoustics of the place created disorienting echoes, multiplying sounds in unsettling ways. There, by the creek bank, they discovered further evidence: a woolen blanket hung from a low branch to dry, and nearby marks on the ground, showing where someone had rested. The sheriff instructed the men to spread out for broader coverage, but to keep each other in sight, wary of anyone becoming lost in that natural labyrinth of stone and trees. An experienced tracker named Jesse Tate noticed something the others had missed: scratches on a rock suggesting a climb toward a higher formation. Following this trail, he soon found the entrance to a small cave concealed by vegetation. The shallow cave, no more than 5 or 6 meters deep, offered shelter from the elements. Inside were signs of recent use: food scraps, a half-empty water bottle, and a torn cloth that seemed to have served as a bandage. But Mabel was not there. She had moved on, likely aware of being pursued. What most captured the sheriff's attention was a small notebook left deep in the cave, partly hidden under loose stones. Opening it, he recognized the same elegant handwriting from the diary at the cabin. These were recent entries, written during her flight. Mabel wrote of the regret consuming her, of sleepless nights haunted by the faces of those who had trusted her. She described how it all began merely as a struggle for survival, claiming the first incident was an accident, a heated argument that ended tragically, and how each subsequent step thereafter felt inevitable. The notebook entries revealed a tormented mind. Mabel wrote that she knew there was no return, that her former life ended the moment she crossed that line. She mentioned considering surrender, but fear of public judgment, humiliation, and the gallows kept her moving. There were also passages where she attempted to justify her actions, arguing the travelers were merely passing strangers whom no one would truly miss, and that she herself had been forgotten and abandoned by society. The sheriff closed the notebook with a heavy sigh. These words did not absolve Mabel of her deeds, but they offered a glimpse into how a person could reach such a point. Extreme loneliness, crushing poverty, and the absence of any support network had created an environment where morality slowly eroded until the unthinkable became possible. Yet, there remained real victims, individuals with families who deserved justice. The search continued with renewed resolve. The notebook suggested Mabel was injured, possibly with a sprained ankle hindering her movement, explaining her frequent stops to rest. The group now had an advantage and knew it was only a matter of time before they closed in. As they progressed further south, the terrain began to shift. Dense forest gave way to more open areas with exposed rock and less vegetation. This landscape was easier to traverse, but offered fewer hiding places. Mabel would be increasingly exposed, her options for escape dwindling with each mile. The sun was setting when they spotted movement in the distance, a lone figure walking slowly along a rocky ridge, visibly limping. Sheriff Pritchard raised his binoculars and confirmed it was Marybelle Carter. After days of relentless pursuit, they had finally found her. The men positioned themselves strategically to encircle the area and prevent another escape. The final confrontation was at hand. Sheriff Pritchard signaled his men to advance cautiously, hoping to avoid any desperate reaction that could lead to further tragedy. Mabel, focused on navigating the rough terrain with her injured leg, had not yet noticed their presence. The orange evening light cast long shadows across the rocks, creating an almost surreal setting for this concluding moment. When they were close enough to be heard, the sheriff called her name. Marybelle stopped dead, her entire body stiffening as if struck. She turned slowly, and for the first time, the men could see her face clearly. It was etched with extreme exhaustion, her sunken eyes betraying sleepless nights, and her expression held a deep resignation. She did not attempt to run or cry out. She simply stood there on the edge of the rocky ridge, as if she had long been waiting for this moment. Pritchard took a few more steps forward, keeping his hands visible to show he meant no violence. He told her she needed to return with them, that matters required clarification, that families deserved answers. Mabel listened in silence, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon where the sun met the mountains. When she finally spoke, her voice was faint and strained with emotion. She said she knew there was no escape, that she had expected capture from the moment she left the cabin. Mabel explained she had fled, not because she believed she could evade justice, but because she needed time to process all she had done, to finally confront the person she had become. She mentioned that during those days alone in the mountains with her thoughts, she had relived every encounter, every decision, every moment when she could have chosen a different path. The sheriff asked about the travelers, about what had truly happened at that cabin over the years. Mabel closed her eyes for a long moment before answering. She said the first time had been a genuine accident. A merchant named Richard Dawson had come to her property in 1918 to sell tools. They talked, and he agreed to stay for dinner due to approaching bad weather. That evening, an argument erupted over payment for some goods Mabel had previously purchased, but could not pay for. The argument escalated. Richard grew aggressive, and in the heat of the confrontation, something occurred that changed everything. After that first incident, Mabel panicked. She knew that if the truth were discovered, she would be hanged without hesitation. Society would not forgive a woman in her situation, especially given her already questionable reputation. So she hid all evidence, buried the belongings, and tried to carry on as if nothing had happened. But something inside her had broken. The line between right and wrong, once so clear, became blurred. When another traveler appeared months later, Mabel saw an opportunity. She desperately needed money, and this man carried enough coins to see her through the winter. Rationalization came easily. No one would know. No one would miss a passing stranger. And so began a pattern that would repeat over the following years. It grew easier to justify, to silence her conscience, to view these people not as individuals with lives and families, but as solutions to her problems. Mabel spoke of the loneliness that consumed her in that isolated cabin. She described how the nights felt endless, how the mountain silence pressed down on her like a great weight. There was no one to talk to, no one who cared whether she lived or died. Bitterness grew within her, like a weed, poisoning every thought and feeling. She began to blame the world for her situation, to see everyone else as enemies who had abandoned her. The sheriff listened silently, his grave expression revealing the weight of these confessions. The other men remained quiet, some visibly disturbed by Mabel's words. She continued speaking, as if needing to release everything held inside for so long. She mentioned the times she had almost turned herself in, the occasions she had gone to town intending to confess everything to the sheriff, but always retreating at the last moment, unable to face the consequences. When she finished, Mabel seemed smaller, as if the burden of her words had hollowed her out. She extended her wrists toward the sheriff in a gesture of complete surrender. Pritchard slowly approached and secured the iron handcuffs, the metallic click echoing through the silent valley. The group began the return journey, moving slowly to accommodate Mabel's injured leg. The descent from the mountains took 2 full days. Throughout the trek, Mabel remained silent, lost in her thoughts. When they finally reached Norton, a crowd already awaited in the streets. News of her capture had preceded them, and hundreds gathered to see the woman who had caused such horror. Some shouted insults, others simply watched in stunned silence. The sheriff had to push through the crowd to take her to the county jail. Mabel was placed in an isolated cell, where she would remain until her trial. The cold stone walls and the small barred window now defined her world. She sat on the narrow bunk and looked at her hands, hands that had worked the land, cooked meals, and committed acts that now haunted her. The silence of the cell was different from the silence of the mountains. This was a silence of finality, of closing doors, of a future that no longer existed. The days following Marybelle Carter's capture were marked by unprecedented unrest in Wise County. The small town of Norton, normally quiet and predictable, became a regional focal point. Journalists from neighboring counties arrived, notebooks in hand, eager for details about the case already dubbed the Appalachian Horror. The Norton Gazette published daily extra editions that sold out within hours. People sought to understand how this could have happened right under their noses, how someone living among them, however isolated, could have kept such dark secrets for so long. Sheriff Pritchard organized a team dedicated solely to investigating every aspect of Mabel's life and identifying all possible victims. The task was monumental. Records from that time were poor, especially in rural mountain areas where many lived without proper documentation. Traveling merchants, in particular, were difficult to trace. Many had no fixed address, constantly moving from town to town, county to county, following business opportunities. Their families, if they had any, often lost contact for long periods without considering it unusual. The team began working with the objects found in the cabin, trying to connect each item to a specific person. A silver pocket watch engraved with the initials WH was identified as belonging to William Hodges, a draper from Kentucky who had disappeared in 1919. His family, contacted by telegraph, confirmed that William's last letter mentioned plans to cross the Virginia mountains before returning home. That letter, found among Mabel's belongings, had never been sent. A simple wedding ring inscribed inside with, "To Leonard, with eternal love," was recognized by Leonard Monroe's sister. She traveled to Norton to see the ring, and holding it in trembling hands, burst into tears. She told investigators Leonard was a kind man who helped anyone in need, and likely offered assistance to Mabel without realizing the danger. Leonard's wife, now unknowingly widowed, faced the terrible truth of her husband's fate. Each object had a story. Each identification brought more pain to families who had spent years not knowing the fate of their loved ones. A Tennessee blacksmith recognized a pair of fine leather boots as the kind he had made for his cousin, a hunter who vanished during an expedition through the region in 1920. A Bible with a name inscribed on the cover had belonged to an itinerant preacher who traveled the Appalachians, offering sermons in isolated communities. His congregation in West Virginia had prayed for his safe return for months, never imagining he would not come back. As the investigation continued, the county prosecutor, a stern man named Theodore Blackwood, began preparing the case for trial. Blackwood was known for his uncompromising stance on crime and had publicly stated he would seek the maximum penalty for Mabel. He saw the case not only as a matter of individual justice, but as an opportunity to send a clear message about the rule of law, even in the most remote areas. No one, he argued, was above the law, regardless of personal circumstances. Mabel's defense was taken up by a local attorney named Samuel Garrett, appointed by the court as she lacked resources to hire representation. Garrett was a middle-aged man known for his compassion and belief that everyone deserved a fair defense, no matter the severity of the charges. He visited Mabel in her cell several times in the weeks before the trial, attempting to devise a strategy that might at least spare her life from the gallows. During these conversations, Garrett learned aspects of Mabel's story not widely known. She told him of her difficult childhood in a poor mining family, losing 3 brothers, young to illness and accidents, and marrying at 16 to a man who promised to rescue her from misery. The initially promising marriage deteriorated when her husband began drinking heavily. He died 5 years later in a mining accident, leaving her alone and in debt. Mabel described the following years as a slow drowning. She tried to find work washing, sewing, taking whatever chores she could, but prejudice against single women in mountain communities made everything harder. Some men harassed her, seeing her as vulnerable. Other women avoided her, considering her a threat. She found herself increasingly isolated, pushed to the margins of society, until she finally moved to that remote cabin where she could live without constant judgmental stares. Garrett knew this tragic history did not justify Mabel's actions, but he hoped it might foster some understanding of how a person could reach such a point. He planned to argue that extreme loneliness and crushing poverty had impaired his client's judgment, that she wasn't an innate monster, but a person broken by impossible circumstances who had made terrible decisions as a result. Meanwhile, the press continued to fuel public interest. Speculative articles began appearing in regional newspapers, some depicting Mabel as a calculating monster, others as a victim of society turned perpetrator. Dramatic illustrations showed the lonely mountain cabin enveloped in ominous fog, or portrayed Mabel as a shadowy figure stalking unsuspecting travelers. The truth, as always, was more complex than any simplistic portrayal. As the trial date neared, the victims' families started arriving in Norton. They wanted to be present, to look into the eyes of the woman who had taken their loved ones, to hear whatever explanations might exist. The local hotel filled, and residents opened their homes to accommodate visitors. The entire town seemed suspended, awaiting a final reckoning. In her cell, Mabel spent her days in profound silence, refusing most meals and eating only enough to survive. Occasionally, she wrote on scraps of paper provided by the sheriff. These notes, carefully guarded, contained reflections on her life, her choices, and the regret that now consumed her. In one entry, she wrote that the worst part was not the fear of death, but having to live with herself, knowing what she had done. A local priest, Reverend Marcus Sullivan, began regular visits. He explained he was not there to judge, but to offer spiritual comfort if desired. Mabel, not particularly religious, welcomed the visits primarily as a break from the suffocating monotony of her cell. During their conversations, the Reverend tried to guide her toward genuine repentance and the search for some form of redemption, though he knew time was limited. The court scheduled the trial's start for the first week of December, 1921. The courtroom was prepared to accommodate as many as possible, though everyone knew it would be insufficient. Hundreds wished to attend, with only a few dozen seats available. Presiding Judge Harold Morrison, known for his seriousness and impartiality, made clear he would not tolerate emotional displays or disorder. As the day approached, tension in the town grew. Conversations everywhere revolved around the same theme. What had transformed Mabel Carter? Was loneliness and despair enough to completely corrupt someone's morals? Or was there something darker in her nature, waiting for the right conditions to emerge? These questions had no easy answers. The case had become a mirror reflecting the community's own failings. How often had they ignored someone in need, judged without understanding? How many people lived isolated in the mountains, struggling alone against overwhelming odds, unseen by all? The horror of Mabel's actions could not be denied, but neither could it be completely separated from its context. The trial morning dawned cold and gray over Norton, with a dense fog blanketing the streets and the penetrating humidity of an Appalachian winter. People crowded the courthouse before dawn, vying for the few gallery seats. Those unable to enter remained outside, awaiting news delivered by messengers throughout the day. Mabel was led from her cell to the courtroom under heavy guard. She wore a simple dark dress someone had donated, her hair in its usual tight bun, her tired eyes holding a surprising dignity. When she entered, a heavy silence fell. Hundreds of eyes fixed on her, some filled with hatred, others with morbid curiosity, a few with something resembling compassion. Judge Morrison opened the session with careful words, emphasizing this was a court of law, not a public spectacle, and demanding absolute decorum. Prosecutor Theodore Blackwood rose to present the charges, his voice resonating with authority and controlled indignation. He outlined the known facts: the discovery in the cabin, the belongings of at least 6 identified individuals, and the implicating diary entries. He called witnesses from the investigation, including Sheriff Pritchard, who detailed the cellar findings, careful to avoid overly disturbing elements while making the magnitude clear. The victims' families were called to testify. Leonard Monroe's sister, eyes swollen, spoke of her kind, helpful brother and his wife and daughters, who waited endlessly. Her voice broke constantly. William Hodges's wife, Martha, frail-looking, testified about years of uncertainty, how she had believed her husband alive somewhere, unable to return. Discovering the truth, she said, was both relief and agony. She looked directly at Mabel, searching for some reaction. The cousin of the missing Tennessee hunter spoke of a man who loved the mountains, knew every trail, and would never have simply gotten lost. When the defense's turn came, Samuel Garrett stood with respectful determination. He did not attempt to deny the prosecution's facts, impossible given the evidence. Instead, he focused on building a complete portrait of Mabel Carter as a human being. He called people who knew her before the events. A former neighbor, reluctant but conscience-driven, described how Mabel had helped her family when her husband fell ill, bringing food and remedies without expectation. She spoke of the visible loneliness in Mabel's eyes, of a woman sinking into a dark pit. This did not justify later actions, she clarified, but offered context for who Mabel had been. Reverend Sullivan testified about their cell conversations, speaking of the genuine remorse he witnessed, of her sleepless nights tormented by nightmares of her victims. He was careful not to defend the indefensible, but believed it important the court understand the remorse existed. Garrett then did something unexpected. He called Mabel to testify in her own defense. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Prosecutor Blackwood objected, arguing this was highly irregular and potentially damaging. Judge Morrison considered before allowing it, ensuring Mabel understood anything she said could be used against her. Mabel walked to the witness stand with measured steps, placed her hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth, her voice low but firm. Garrett began with simple questions about her life, establishing the already partial context. Mabel answered directly, without evoking excessive pity. When asked about the specific events, she took a deep breath. She confirmed her responsibility for the disappearances, stating there was no denying that truth. Her voice growing thick with emotion, she explained how each incident began differently, but followed a similar pattern. Travelers arriving, basic hospitality offered, an opportunity presenting itself. She spoke of the first time, of Richard Dawson, and the argument that escalated. She admitted that in that moment of panic, she made decisions that determined everything after the choice to hide, to protect herself instead of facing consequences. Each subsequent choice became easier. The moral line blurred until she no longer recognized herself. Mabel looked at the victims' families in the front row. Tears streamed down her face as she spoke directly to them. She said no words could undo what she had done. No apology would be enough. She acknowledged her victims were real people with real lives and families who loved and waited for them. She admitted she had tried to dehumanize them to make her actions tolerable, but now saw clearly the horror of it. When Prosecutor Blackwood cross-examined her, he was relentless, forcing Mabel to confront contradictions, to admit she had opportunities to stop but chose to continue. He questioned whether her regret was genuine or merely fear of the gallows, whether her tears were for her victims or herself. Mabel answered honestly that it was probably both. She couldn't separate remorse from terror. The interrogation lasted hours, leaving Mabel exhausted, as if each word had drained more life from her. She returned to her seat beside Garrett, shoulders hunched under the weight of her public confession. The room fell silent, everyone processing what they had witnessed. Closing arguments began the next day. Blackwood presented a powerful case for the maximum sentence, arguing society and the victims needed justice, and that leniency would betray the memory of the dead. He acknowledged Mabel's hardships, but argued many lived in similar or worse conditions without resorting to evil. Garrett, in his final defense, did not ask for an acquittal. He knew it impossible. Instead, he asked for mercy, for recognition that Mabel was a human being who committed terrible acts, but was also a product of circumstances society helped create. He argued the death penalty would not bring the victims back or heal the family's pain, and perhaps there was more justice in allowing Mabel to live with the weight of her actions for the rest of her days. The jury retired to deliberate, and the waiting began. Their deliberations stretched for 3 full days. During that time, Norton seemed to hold its collective breath. People gathered everywhere, speculating about the verdict. Some argued guilt was proven beyond doubt. Others debated the appropriate sentence, divided between the gallows and life imprisonment. The victims' families remained, forming a temporary community united by shared grief. They talked about their lost loved ones, shared memories, and comforted one another. Martha Hodges spent hours talking with Leonard Monroe's sister, discovering their husbands had been remarkably similar kind and trusting, qualities that ironically made them vulnerable. This connection between strangers was one of the few positive things to emerge from the darkness. Inside the deliberation room, the jury faced decisions that would weigh on their consciences for life. 12 county men, chosen for supposed impartiality, now had to determine not only guilt, but the ultimate fate of a woman many knew, at least by sight. Arguments were intense. Some jurors argued the law was clear and personal emotions should not interfere. Others wrestled with deeper questions about moral culpability, free will, and the circumstances shaping human choices. One juror, a farmer named Benjamin Winters, expressed the inner struggle many felt. Having lost his own wife years earlier, he knew the crushing loneliness of the mountains and could imagine, albeit imperfectly, how someone might slip into a dark place. But then he thought of the victims, travelers merely seeking a safe place to rest who found death instead. How does one balance understanding with justice? How does one weigh past suffering against present crimes? While the jury deliberated, Mabel remained in her cell, distant from the tumult. She had stopped writing, doing nothing but sitting on the narrow bunk and staring at the stone walls. Reverend Sullivan visited daily, offering prayers and comfort, though unsure they reached her. Mabel seemed in a place beyond human words, an inner space where she confronted her ghosts alone. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, a messenger rushed from the courthouse with news. The jury had reached a verdict. Word spread quickly. Within minutes, a crowd gathered. Mabel was brought back into the courtroom, escorted by Sheriff Pritchard and 2 deputies. She walked as if in a trance, movements mechanical, gaze fixed on a distant point only she could see. Judge Morrison returned to his seat, expression grave and weary. The jurors filed in, none looking in Mabel's direction, an ominous sign to many. The jury foreman, a respected businessman named David Hutchinson, stood when asked. The silence was so complete, the rustling of his clothes seemed loud. Morrison asked if the jury had reached a verdict. Hutchinson confirmed it had. When asked about the verdict on the murder charges, he replied firmly it was unanimous. Guilty on all counts. A collective gasp went through the room, though few were genuinely surprised. Mabel did not react visibly, remaining seated with the same distant expression. The judge moved to the sentencing phase, Prosecutor Blackwood rose to make his final recommendations, reiterating that nothing less than the maximum sentence was appropriate, given the gravity and repetitive nature of the crimes. He spoke on behalf of the victims who could no longer speak, on behalf of a society needing protection from those who placed themselves outside moral and civil law. Samuel Garrett, fulfilling his duty to the end, made a final plea for clemency. He did not minimize the crimes or paint Mabel as innocent. Instead, he asked the judge to consider the full complexity of the situation, to recognize that punishment did not necessarily mean execution, that other forms of justice would allow Mabel to live with the weight of her actions while still being held accountable to society. Judge Morrison listened to both arguments in silence, his hands resting calmly on the table before him. When it was time to deliver the sentence, he asked Mabel to stand. She did so slowly, steadying herself against the table. Morrison began by speaking of the gravity of the crimes, the devastating impact on the victims' families, and the necessity for society to uphold its laws. Then, after a pause that felt interminable, he pronounced the sentence, death by hanging, to be carried out within 60 days. The reaction in the courtroom was mixed. Some nodded in grim approval. Others lowered their heads in somber reflection. The victims' families experienced varied emotions. Some felt a sense of justice being served, while others felt only a hollow emptiness, knowing no sentence could truly return their loved ones. Mabel received the verdict without visible reaction, as if she had always known this outcome. She was escorted back to her cell, where she would now spend her final days. The certainty of the date transformed the nature of her imprisonment, replacing uncertainty with an inevitable countdown. Reverend Sullivan intensified his visits, focusing on helping Mabel come to terms with her fate and seek possible spiritual redemption. In the following weeks, something unexpected occurred. Mabel began speaking more openly to the Reverend, not just about her crimes, but about her entire life. She shared memories from her youth, of happier times before her world darkened, of dreams she once held, and how reality had systematically shattered them. She also resumed writing, but now it was letters. Letters addressed to the families of her victims. In each, she attempted to offer some form of closure, providing truthful details about their loved ones' final moments, hoping it might bring a fragment of peace. She did not attempt to apologize, knowing words were inadequate, but offered the unvarnished truth for each family to interpret. Some families refused the letters, wanting nothing from the woman who had destroyed their lives. Others read them only to burn them, finding no value. Yet a few, like Martha Hodges, kept the letters carefully. Martha told the Reverend that, however painful, knowing exactly what happened to William was preferable to a lifetime of torturous uncertainty. Dark knowledge, at least, ended the years of wondering. As the execution date approached, life in Norton gradually returned to its routine. Journalists sought new stories, the victims' families returned home to rebuild, and the town's daily rhythm resumed. But a permanent change had occurred, a loss of collective innocence. The belief that such evil only happened in distant places was shattered. People now looked at the surrounding mountains differently, seeing not only natural beauty, but also the dark secrets their shadows might hold. Mabel spent her final days in silent contemplation, accepting her sentence without protest or appeal. Reverend Sullivan noted she seemed to have found a resigned peace, not happiness or absolution, but an acceptance of what was to come. She told him death might be a mercy, a release not only from the world, but from the person she had become. The last days of January 1922 brought a severe cold to the Virginia mountains. Snow blanketed the Appalachian foothills, muffling all sound. Norton awoke each morning under a gray sky that seemed to mirror the town's heavy atmosphere. Public executions of the era often drew crowds, viewed as both justice and macabre spectacle. However, Sheriff Pritchard decided this execution would be different. Having witnessed such events devolve into disrespectful circuses, he allowed only a limited number of official witnesses, including the victims' families who wished to attend. Mabel spent her final weeks in an almost monastic routine. She woke before dawn, spent hours in silent prayer, ate sparingly, and devoted most of her time to writing. In addition to the letters, she composed a detailed confession intended for the county archives, a record for future generations to fully understand what had transpired. She wrote of each victim, each encounter, each deliberate choice, sparing no detail of her rationalizations and her conscience's gradual erosion. Her confession provided a disturbing window into her psychological transformation. She described the weeks of panic after the first incident with Richard Dawson, waiting to be discovered. When no one came, something shifted within her. The guilt didn't vanish, but was replaced by a kind of dissociation. She began to see her actions as separate from herself, as if another person committed them while her true self watched helplessly. This dissociation facilitated subsequent crimes. She could be a cordial hostess by day, while a calculating part of her mind plotted. She acknowledged this did not absolve her responsibility, but offered insight into how a person could live with such extreme contradictions. Reverend Sullivan spent long hours discussing these writings with Mabel. He was both disturbed and uncomfortably fascinated by this first-hand account of how humanity could fragment, how morality could be eroded by loneliness, despair, and repeated poor choices. During one of their final conversations, Mabel made an observation that would haunt Sullivan. The most terrifying part was realizing how easy it had been to cross those lines. She insisted she was not a born monster, but an ordinary person who encountered extreme circumstances and made terrible choices. If that was true for her, it was potentially true for anyone. Everyone carries within them the capacity for both good and evil, and circumstances determine which emerges. This idea disturbed those who heard it, challenging the comfortable narrative of fundamental otherness. The victims' families had varied reactions. Some, like Martha Hodges, found value in understanding Mabel's mindset. Others saw it as manipulation. Leonard Monroe's sister refused to read anything Mabel wrote, arguing nothing could change the fact her brother was dead. As the execution date approached, Sheriff Pritchard made preparations. The executioner, a professional from a neighboring county, arrived 3 days early to inspect the equipment and make precise calculations. He admitted executing a woman always unsettled him more, a feeling he couldn't rationally explain. Mabel's final night was spent in near total vigil. Reverend Sullivan remained with her, reading scripture and offering prayers. Mabel remained calm, telling him she was ready. She had carried the weight long enough and hoped for an end to her conscience's torment. She made one final request, that her writings be preserved not as morbid curiosity, but as a warning about how extreme isolation can break a person, how the absence of community and compassion can create monsters from human beings struggling to survive. If her story could inspire even one person to show more kindness to someone in distress, perhaps some redemptive meaning could be found. Sullivan promised to honor her request, though he doubted the writings would be received as she hoped. At dawn, on the day of the execution, Mabel sat on her bunk, hands folded, eyes closed in meditation. She had slept little but showed no exhaustion, her expression serene, as if she had already begun detaching from the physical world. Sheriff Pritchard arrived at sunrise, offering a final meal, which she declined, asking only for water. She listened calmly as he explained the proceedings. The courthouse's rear courtyard had been prepared with a simple, functional wooden structure, meticulously tested. The sky remained overcast, a diffuse light illuminating the scene. Witnesses began arriving shortly before 8 o'clock, fewer than 20 in total, as per the sheriff's orders. Among them were Martha Hodges and Leonard Monroe's sister, both in black, faces pale. Prosecutor Blackwood, Judge Morrison, a few regional journalists under strict decorum rules, and Reverend Sullivan were also present. Mabel was escorted from the building by the sheriff and 2 deputies. She walked steadily despite light ankle chains, wearing the same dark dress from the trial, her hair down for the first time in memory, falling in dark waves. There was a dignified serenity in her posture. At the foot of the structure, she paused and looked at the witnesses. Her eyes met Martha Hodges's briefly. A silent communication passed between them. Then Mabel turned to Sheriff Pritchard and nodded, indicating she was ready. The sheriff asked if she had any final words. Mabel took a deep breath, her voice strong and clear in the cool air. She said she did not ask for forgiveness, knowing none existed for her actions. She acknowledged the immeasurable pain she had caused and that no explanation could change that. She expressed hope her story might warn of the dangers of extreme isolation and societal indifference, but she did not offer it as an excuse. Addressing the families directly, she said she would carry the faces of her victims with her after death, as was right. She thanked Reverend Sullivan for his spiritual comfort, though unsure she deserved it. Finally, she looked toward the distant mountains and said she had once loved those lands before they became silent witnesses to her crimes. Then, her voice cracking slightly, she simply said she was ready. The executioner positioned her professionally. Reverend Sullivan approached, offering a final, low, rapid prayer for divine mercy. Mabel closed her eyes, her lips moving silently. The process was carried out efficiently and quickly, without unnecessary drama or prolonged agony. Within minutes, it was over. Marybelle Carter, who had lived 33 years in those mountains, who had known love, loss, loneliness, and despair, who had crossed terrible lines and destroyed innocent lives, was no more. Her body was turned over to the county for burial in an unmarked plot, destined to be forgotten. The witnesses dispersed slowly, each carrying their own thoughts. Martha Hodges lingered, staring at the now empty structure, questioning whether she felt any justice or closure. She concluded that perhaps true closure was impossible for such loss. Only the need to move forward, carrying the absence like a wound that would never fully heal. In the following days and weeks, Norton returned to normal. Journalists published final articles and moved on. The victims' families returned to their forever changed lives. The mountain cabin was burned by county order, its smoke drifting over snow-covered slopes, erasing the last physical trace of that dark history. Reverend Sullivan kept his promise, depositing Mabel's writings in the county archives with instructions for their educational purpose. Over the years, scholars would occasionally examine them, debating questions of moral responsibility and extenuating circumstances. But for most in Norton and the surrounding area, Marybelle Carter gradually became a whispered story, a dark mountain legend, a name associated with a time they wished to forget. The Appalachian Mountains remained, eternal and impassive, their forests and valleys holding countless other secrets. Life continued to flow through those lands as it always had. New travelers on the trails, new families on the slopes, new chapters in the region's long history. But those who knew Marybelle Carter's story never looked at those mountains quite the same way again. There was a painful lesson buried in that tragedy, one many preferred to ignore, but that remained relevant. Mabel's story was not only about a woman who committed terrible crimes, but also about a society that allowed someone to fall through every safety net, to become isolated and marginalized until their humanity unraveled. It did not excuse her actions, but offered context for how evil can emerge, not from innate monsters, but from ordinary people, broken by extreme circumstances and accumulated poor choices. Travelers passing through those mountains today, over a century later, rarely know the history of 1921. The trails have been modernized, technology has transformed communication and travel, and the world has changed unimaginably. But human nature remains fundamentally the same, with its capacity for kindness and cruelty, compassion and indifference, redemption and fall. The story of Mabel Carter and the lives she destroyed serves as a grim reminder that evil rarely emerges dramatically. Often, it grows slowly in the shadows, fueled by isolation, despair, and the gradual erosion of moral principles. It also stands as a cautionary tale about the importance of community, compassion, and not allowing people to fall to the margins where darkness can consume them completely. The mountains of Virginia hold this story as they hold so many others. Silent and impassive witnesses to generations of human lives, with all their complexity, tragedy, and mystery. On winter nights, when mist descends into the valleys and the wind howls through ancient trees, it is easy to imagine those mountains still remember, that echoes of those distant events resonate in their depths, a whispered memory of when civilization failed and darkness prevailed.